Imagine waking up in a world where the person meant to save your life is carrying a bone saw covered in the blood of the 10 patients he treated before you. There are no painkillers. There is no concept of germs. In this world, being sick wasn't just a physical struggle. It was a descent into a living nightmare of miracle cures that were more lethal than the diseases themselves. From the plague-ravaged streets of medieval Europe to the mercury-soaked hospitals of the Victorian era, the history of medicine is not a story of healing. It is a horror story of torture, superstition, and the disturbing ways humanity treated its most vulnerable. Close your eyes and listen, because what you are about to hear will make you grateful for every second of modern medicine. This is the disturbing reality of how we used to cure the sick. For nearly 2,000 years, Western medicine was governed by a single catastrophic misunderstanding, the theory of the four humors. Doctors believed the human body was a vessel filled with four liquids: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. If you fell ill, it wasn't because of a virus or bacteria. It was because these liquids were out of balance. And the most common way to fix that balance? You had to bleed. The practice of bloodletting was as universal as it was gruesome. If you had a fever, a headache, or even broken bones, the local barber surgeon, yes, the same man who cut your hair, would reach for a phleem, a rusted folding spike, and slice open a vein. In many cases, they would drain the patient until they fainted. The logic was chilling. If the patient lost consciousness, it meant the bad blood had left the body. But it wasn't just blades. One of the most disturbing sights in a historical sick room was the use of medicinal leeches. Imagine lying in a dark room while a doctor places dozens of slimy, blood-sucking worms across your chest and face. These creatures would gorge themselves on your blood until they tripled in size, falling off only when they were too full to cling to your skin. In the year 1833 alone, France imported over 40 million leeches for medical use. People were literally being drained of the very fluid they needed to fight off infection, all while their doctors watched with satisfaction, believing they were purging the evil within. Even the most powerful men in the world weren't safe. When George Washington developed a throat infection in 1799, his physicians treated him by draining nearly 40% of his total blood volume in less than 24 hours. He didn't die from the cold, he died from the cure. This was a world where the sick were treated like leaking pipes that needed to be emptied, rather than human beings who needed to be healed. If you think bloodletting was a nightmare, the operating theater of the 1800s was a literal house of horrors. Before the mid-19th century, the two things we take for granted today, anesthesia and antisepsis, did not exist. Surgery was not a delicate procedure. It was a race against the clock. To a surgeon in this era, speed was the only thing that mattered. The longer the patient was on the table, the more likely they were to die from the sheer agony of the experience or the inevitable shock to their nervous system. Imagine being strapped down to a wooden table that is stained dark with the blood of previous patients. There is no gas to put you to sleep, no numbing cream, and no painkillers. At most, you might be given a leather strap to bite on or a stiff drink of whiskey. The theater was often filled with medical students and curious onlookers, all leaning in to watch the carnage. The air smelled of rot, unwashed bodies, and raw iron. The surgeon would walk in wearing a silk coat that he proudly never washed. The more dried blood and pus caked onto his sleeves, the more experienced he appeared to be. The most feared sound in the hospital was the rasp of the bone saw. For an amputation, the surgeon would slice through the muscle with a curved knife and then begin sawing through the bone as fast as humanly possible. Some of the most famous surgeons, like Robert Liston, could remove a leg in under 3 minutes, but speed came at a terrifying price. In one legendary and tragic case, Liston worked so fast that he accidentally sliced off his assistant's fingers and slashed the coat of a spectator.
The patient and the assistant both died of gangrene, and the spectator died of a heart attack from pure terror. It remains the only surgery in history with a 300% mortality rate. But the physical pain was only the beginning of the humiliation. Because doctors didn't understand germs, they would often use the same tools on dozens of patients without so much as wiping them down. They would move from a corpse in the morgue straight to a woman giving birth, carrying death on their hands. If you survived the surgery, you almost certainly wouldn't survive the ward fever or hospital gangrene that followed. The sick were kept in crowded, damp rooms where the bandages were often reused, spreading rot from one open wound to the next. In this era, the hospital wasn't a place you went to get better. It was the place you went to die, screaming, while a crowd of strangers watched your final moments.
While surgeons were busy hacking at limbs, the local physicians and apothecaries were busy poisoning the insides of their patients. Today, we look at the back of a medicine bottle to check for side effects. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the medicine itself was often a death sentence. The philosophy of the time was simple. If a treatment didn't cause a violent reaction in the body, it wasn't working. The undisputed king of the medicine cabinet was mercury. Known as quicksilver, this heavy metal was prescribed for almost everything, from syphilis and yellow fever to a simple case of constipation. Doctors didn't care that mercury is a potent neurotoxin. They were delighted when patients began to drool uncontrollably, a condition called salivation. They believed the excess spit was the body's way of flushing out the disease. In reality, the patients were suffering from acute mercury poisoning. Their gums would rot, their teeth would fall out, and their bones would literally begin to soften and decay while they were still alive. But the horror didn't stop at mercury. If you were feeling anxious or had a cough, a Victorian doctor might hand you a bottle of laudanum. This was a potent mixture of alcohol and high-grade opium. It didn't cure the illness, it just turned the patient into a wandering ghost, blissfully unaware as their body failed. Entire generations, including children, became hopelessly addicted to these soothing syrups. For a crying infant, mothers were encouraged to use Godfrey's cordial, which contained enough opium to stop a child's breathing entirely. Thousands of babies died in their sleep, shushed to death by the very medicine meant to help them. Then there was the use of arsenic. This deadly poison was used to treat skin conditions and malaria, and it was even used in Fowler's solution as a general health tonic. It gave the patient a rosy-cheeked glow, a glow that was actually the result of capillary damage and slow organ failure. People were walking around with their insides slowly burning away, thanking their doctors for the healthy color in their faces. Perhaps the most disturbing treatments involved strychnine and antimony. Antimony was used to induce violent projectile vomiting. One popular device was the perpetual pill, a solid ball of antimony that the patient would swallow. It would irritate the intestines so severely that it passed through the body almost instantly. Because metal was expensive, families would actually retrieve the pill from the waste, wash it, and save it for the next person who got sick. It was a cycle of toxicity and filth passed down through generations, all in the name of cleansing the soul of its ailments. In the annals of history, there was no fate more terrifying than being labeled insane. While the physically ill faced saws and poisons, those with mental afflictions faced a special kind of purgatory. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the mind was a mystery that doctors believed could only be solved through shocks to the system. The goal wasn't to comfort the patient, it was to break them. The most notorious symbol of this era was Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, famously known as Bedlam. Here, the treatment for the sick was indistinguishable from the punishment of a high-security prison.
Patients were kept in unheated stone cells, often shackled to the walls with heavy iron chains. They slept on straw bedding that was rarely changed, soaked in their own filth. The prevailing medical theory was that the mad lacked human feelings. Doctors believed they didn't feel the cold or hunger like normal people did, which justified keeping them in freezing skeletal conditions. But the most disturbing aspect of Bedlam wasn't just the neglect, it was the commercialization of misery. On weekends, the asylum opened its doors to the public. For the price of a penny, wealthy Londoners and curious tourists could stroll through the hallways as if they were visiting a zoo. They would poke the patients with sticks, laugh at their delusions, and bait them into violent outbursts for entertainment. The sick were not seen as humans in need of care. They were a Sunday afternoon spectacle, a freak show designed to remind the sane how lucky they were. The actual medical interventions were even worse. To reset the brain, doctors used the rotational chair. The patient would be strapped into a chair that was suspended from the ceiling and spun at high speeds, sometimes up to 100 revolutions per minute. The result was predictable. The patient would vomit, bleed from the nose, and eventually pass out. Doctors called this therapeutic, believing the centrifugal force moved the blood back to its proper place in the brain. If the spinning didn't work, there was the bath of surprise. A patient would be led across a room unsuspecting, only to have a trap door drop them into a pool of ice-cold water. The shock was intended to scare the madness out of the soul. In other cases, patients were subjected to trepanation, the drilling of holes into the skull, to let evil vapors escape. These victims didn't have a voice, and they had no rights. Once you entered the heavy doors of the madhouse, you were often forgotten by the world, left to rot in the dark, while the civilized world paid a penny to watch you suffer.
When the Black Death swept through Europe and Asia, it didn't just kill people, it shattered the human psyche. It was a disease so fast and so disturbing that a person could have breakfast with their family and be dead by dinner. In this atmosphere of pure, unadulterated terror, a new figure emerged, the most iconic and haunting image in medical history, the plague doctor. To a dying citizen in the 14th or 17th century, seeing a plague doctor was like seeing the Grim Reaper himself. They wore heavy leather overcoats coated in wax to repel the disease, and wide-brimmed hats to signify their profession. But it was the mask that truly horrified. It was a long, curved bird's beak, nearly a foot long. The eyes were covered by red glass lenses, which people believed made the doctor immune to the evil eye of the dying. The reason for the beak was based on a deadly scientific error, the miasma theory. Doctors believed the plague was spread by bad air or foul smells. To combat this, they stuffed the tip of the wooden beak with dried flowers, mint, spices, and camphor. They were literally walking through clouds of rotting corpses, breathing in the scent of roses while the world around them dissolved into a charnel house. They carried a long wooden cane, not just to examine the sick without touching them, but to beat back the desperate crowds who would crawl toward them, begging for a miracle that didn't exist. The treatments these doctors offered were nothing short of torture. They believed the buboes, the agonizing, grape-sized swellings in the armpits and groin, needed to be released. They would take a hot iron or a shard of glass and slice the swellings open, then pack them with a mixture of human excrement, crushed dried toads, and herbs. They were literally walking through clouds of rotting corpses, breathing in the scent of roses, while the world around them dissolved into a charnel house. They carried a long wooden cane, not just to examine the sick without touching them, but to beat back the desperate crowds who would crawl toward them, begging for a miracle that didn't exist. The treatments these doctors offered were nothing short of torture. They believed the buboes, the agonizing, grape-sized swellings in the armpits and groin, needed to be released. They would take a hot iron or a shard of glass and slice the swellings open, then pack them with a mixture of human excrement, crushed dried toads, and herbs.
This didn't cure the plague, it caused immediate, searing sepsis, accelerating the patient's death in a flurry of agony. Perhaps the most disturbing way the sick were treated during the plague was the shutting in. If one person in a household showed a single black spot on their skin, the local authorities would bolt the doors and windows from the outside, trapping the entire family, the sick and the healthy, inside. A red cross was painted on the door with the words, "Lord, have mercy on us." You were left to watch your children die, knowing that you were trapped in a tomb with their bodies. In the streets, dead carts rattled over the cobblestones, and the drivers would scream, "Bring out your dead!" Bodies were piled like cordwood, and the sick who were too weak to move were often tossed onto the piles while they were still breathing, buried alive in mass pits because the living were too terrified to check for a pulse. As we move into the 19th century, we encounter a disease that was so romanticized it became a twisted standard of beauty. Tuberculosis, then known as consumption, was a slow, agonizing killer that ate the lungs from the inside out. But unlike the plague, which was seen as a divine curse, consumption was viewed by Victorian society as a poetic way to die. This led to some of the most disturbing social behaviors in the history of medicine. The symptoms of consumption, pale skin, translucent veins, dilated pupils, and red, feverish cheeks, became the height of fashion. Women would actually use toxic makeup containing lead and arsenic to mimic the look of a dying woman. They wanted to look consumptive because the disease was thought to heighten one's spiritual and artistic sensitivity. The sick were not hidden away. They were put on display in parlors, their slow decline watched by friends and family as if it were a tragic play. But behind this thin veil of beauty was a gruesome reality. The treatment for the wealthy usually involved the rest cure. Patients were forbidden from moving, reading, or even thinking. They were locked in rooms with fresh air so cold that ice would form on their blankets, believed to freeze the disease out. For the poor, the treatment was far more sinister. In rural New England, a terrifying superstition took hold: the vampire panic. When multiple members of family began to die of consumption, communities didn't blame bacteria, they blamed the first person who had died. They believed the undead relative was reaching out from the grave to suck the life force from their surviving kin. To cure the remaining sick family members, townsfolk would exhume the bodies of the deceased. If the corpse appeared fresh, usually just a natural result of the cold ground preserving the body, they would cut the heart out of the chest. In a ritual of pure horror, the heart was burned to ashes on a blacksmith's forge. These ashes were then mixed into a tonic or a cup of water and fed to the surviving sick person. They were literally forced to drink the remains of their dead mother, father, or sibling in a desperate cannibalistic attempt to stop the disease. The sick were treated as victims of the supernatural, forced to participate in rituals that make modern horror movies look tame.
Long before the modern syringe, humanity faced its most consistent and visible predator, smallpox. This was a disease that didn't just kill, it marked you. If you were one of the lucky ones to survive, your face and body were often left a map of deep cratered scars. But the way the sick were treated, and the way people tried to prevent the sickness, involved a process that was as stomach-turning as the disease itself. Before the official invention of the vaccine, people practiced something called variolation. It was a gamble of the highest stakes. To protect a healthy person, doctors would take a lancet and scrape a pustule off a person who was actively dying from smallpox. They would then make a deep incision into the healthy person's arm and rub the live, infectious pus directly into their bloodstream. Imagine the scene: a mother holding her child still while a doctor smears the liquid rot of a dying stranger into the child's arm. The hope was that the child would catch a mild case of the disease and become immune. But mild was a relative term. Many of those who were variolated developed full-blown smallpox, becoming patient zero for new outbreaks that wiped out entire villages.
The treated were often forced into pest houses, isolated, rotting shacks on the outskirts of town, where the air was thick with the smell of vinegar and burning sulfur, used in a futile attempt to cleanse the air. As science progressed, the methods became even more bizarre. Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids seemed immune to smallpox because they caught cowpox from the udders of cows. His solution? To create the first vaccine, he took the pus from the lesions of a sick cow and injected it into humans. While this was a medical breakthrough, it sparked a wave of vaccination panic. The public was horrified. Cartoons of the era depicted people growing cow heads out of their arms and legs after receiving the cure. The sick were often caught in the middle of a social war. In many cities, those suspected of having smallpox were dragged from their homes by health squads and forcibly quarantined in smallpox tents. Their clothes and furniture were burned in the streets, and their families were treated as pariahs, forbidden from buying food or working. It was a time when the treatment for a disease meant losing your home, your possessions, and your place in human society. As the world moved into the 20th century, a new miracle was discovered that promised to cure everything from blindness to old age. This was the era of radium. When Marie Curie discovered this radioactive element, the medical world went into a frenzy. It glowed in the dark, it was warm to the touch, and doctors, having no understanding of radiation, assumed this liquid sunshine was the ultimate life force. The sick were no longer treated with leeches, they were treated with the slow burn of atomic energy. Companies began selling Radithor, a patent medicine that was essentially radium dissolved in water. It was marketed as a cure for the living dead. One wealthy industrialist, Eben Byers, was so convinced of its healing powers that he drank nearly 1,400 bottles of the radioactive tonic. He felt incredible at first, but soon the medicine began to eat him from the inside out. His bones began to disintegrate, his entire lower jaw eventually fell off, and his skull developed holes. He was a living skeleton, poisoned by the very cure he had paid a fortune for. But perhaps the most disturbing treatment of the sick occurred in the factories. The radium girls were young women hired to paint watch dials with luminous paint. To get a fine point on their brushes, their supervisors told them to use their lips to point the bristles. Each time they did, they swallowed a tiny amount of radium. When these women began to fall ill, their teeth rotting and their hip bones shattering at the slightest touch, the way they were treated by the medical establishment was a scandal of epic proportions. Doctors hired by the radium corporations lied to the women, telling them they were suffering from syphilis to shame them into silence. The sick were treated as liars and moral outcasts. Even in death, these victims found no peace. Their bodies were so radioactive that they could set off Geiger counters through their coffins. To this day, the remains of the radium girls are buried in lead-lined coffins in Illinois, still glowing in the dark beneath the earth, a permanent, chilling reminder of a time when the world's most advanced medical treatment was actually a death ray.
As we move into the mid-20th century, we reach perhaps the most cold-blooded chapter in medical history. This wasn't a mistake made in the Dark Ages. This was a modern miracle performed in the best hospitals in the world, including the United States. This is the era of the lobotomy. In the 1940s and 50s, psychiatric wards were overcrowded and chaotic. Doctors were desperate for a way to quiet difficult patients, those with depression, schizophrenia, or even just rebellious teenage streaks. Enter Dr. Walter Freeman, a man who believed he had found the ultimate off switch for the human soul. He didn't believe in long, expensive brain surgeries. He wanted something fast, something he could do in his office. The procedure was horrifyingly simple. Freeman would use a tool modeled after a kitchen ice pick. He would lift the patient's eyelid and insert the sharp metal spike into the corner of the eye socket. With a small mallet, he would tap the ice pick through the thin layer of bone and into the frontal lobe of the brain.
Then he would swing the pick back and forth, severing the delicate neural connections that make up a person's personality, memories, and emotions. He called it the transorbital lobotomy. He traveled across the United States in a van he nicknamed the lobotomobile, performing these procedures in front of audiences as if he were a circus act. He could fix a person in under 10 minutes. But what happened to the sick who were cured? They didn't get better, they disappeared. Patients who were once vibrant, emotional, and creative were turned into human vegetables. They were left incontinent, unable to speak, and staring blankly into space for the rest of their lives. One of the most famous victims was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. After her father ordered a lobotomy to control her mood swings, she was left with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, hidden away from the public eye for decades. The most disturbing part was how the medical community celebrated this. The man who invented the original form of the lobotomy, Agus Moniz, was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1949. Thousands of people, including children as young as 4 years old, were subjected to this ice pick miracle. The sick weren't treated as patients to be healed. They were treated as problems to be silenced. We didn't cure their minds. We murdered their identities. As we reached the middle of the 20th century, the way the sick were treated took a turn from misguided science to cold, calculated betrayal. This was the era of human experimentation, where those already suffering from illness or poverty were viewed not as patients, but as clinical material. In the United States, this dark chapter is defined by a complete abandonment of ethics in the name of progress. The most infamous example is the Tuskegee syphilis study. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began tracking 600 black men in Alabama, most of whom were poor sharecroppers. These men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term for various ailments. In reality, they were being studied to see what happened to the human body when syphilis was left completely untreated. Even when penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in the 1940s, a simple treatment that could have saved their lives, the doctors intentionally withheld the medicine. They watched for 40 years as these men went blind, went insane, and died agonizing deaths. The physicians even tracked the men's families, watching as the disease spread to their wives and was born into their children. The sick weren't just ignored, they were actively prevented from getting better so that scientists could perform autopsies on their naturally ravaged bodies. But the horror didn't stop there. At the Willowbrook State School, a facility for children with intellectual disabilities, researchers intentionally infected healthy children with hepatitis. They justified this by claiming that since the facility was so crowded and unsanitary, the children would probably get it anyway. They fed the children milkshakes mixed with the feces of infected patients to track the spread of the virus. These children, who had no voice and no one to protect them, were used as living petri dishes. In other Cold War-era experiments, unsuspecting hospital patients were injected with plutonium to see how the human body handled radiation. Pregnant women were given vitamin drinks that were actually laced with radioactive iron. These people went to the doctor seeking help for a cough, a pregnancy, or a broken bone, and instead they were turned into secret nuclear test subjects. This is perhaps the most disturbing realization in the history of medicine, that the greatest threat to the sick wasn't always the disease, and it wasn't always a doctor's ignorance. Sometimes it was the doctor's curiosity, a curiosity that viewed human suffering as nothing more than a data point on a chart.
As the industrial world expanded, a new kind of architectural terror emerged for those suffering from chronic illness, the sanitarium. Before we had effective antibiotics, the cure for many respiratory diseases was simply to remove the sick from society entirely. If you were diagnosed with a disease like leprosy or tuberculosis, you weren't just a patient, you were an exile. The most chilling examples were the leper colonies. For centuries, people with Hansen's disease, leprosy, were treated as the living dead. In places like Molokai in Hawaii or Carville in Louisiana, once you were diagnosed, you were forcibly removed from your family by law. In some cultures, a priest would even hold a funeral service for you while you were still standing there, signifying that you were dead to the world. You were shipped to isolated islands or fenced-in compounds where the sick were left to govern themselves in a lawless, decaying environment. Guards were posted to ensure no one escaped back to the world of the clean. Then came the tuberculosis sanitariums of the early 20th century. Massive, castle-like structures like Waverly Hills in Kentucky were built on isolated hilltops. These were designed to be self-contained cities, but they quickly became warehouses for the dying. The treatments inside were often experimental and brutal. To collapse a diseased lung and let it rest, doctors would perform thoracoplasty, removing several ribs from the patient's chest so the chest wall would cave in and compress the lung. This left patients permanently deformed and in constant pain. Because the death rate in these sanitariums was so high, the staff had to find a way to remove the bodies without the other patients seeing. This led to the creation of the death tunnel or body chute. It was a long, dark, enclosed ramp that led from the hospital down to the bottom of the hill. When a patient died, their body was slid down the chute in the dead of night to waiting hearses or trains. The psychological torture was just as intense as the physical. Patients were often kept in solaria, open-air porches, even in the dead of winter. They were wrapped in blankets and forced to breathe the freezing air for hours, while their families were only allowed to visit by standing on the other side of a glass partition or a fenced neutral zone. You could see your children, but you could never touch them. Many spent decades in these institutions, forgotten by a world that was too terrified of their breath to offer them a hand to hold. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, while the great minds of the Renaissance were painting masterpieces and exploring the globe, they were also participating in one of history's most stomach-turning medical secrets: medical cannibalism. This wasn't the act of desperate people lost at sea. This was a refined practice where kings, priests, and scholars consumed human remains as a standard treatment, from everything from epilepsy to a simple bruise. The logic was as disturbing as the act itself. Doctors believed that a person's vital spark remained in their remains after death. To regain your health, you had to consume the vitality of the dead. The most prized ingredient was the mumia. Originally, this was a rare substance from the earth, but a massive misunderstanding led Europeans to believe it referred to Egyptian mummies. This sparked a ghoulish trade where thousands of ancient Egyptian bodies were dug up, ground into a fine brown powder, and sold in pharmacies across Europe. If you were a wealthy Londoner with a stomachache, you likely went to the apothecary and bought a bottle of mummy powder to stir into your wine. But for those who couldn't afford imported mummies, there was a fresher, more local option: the shambles of the executioner. Crowds would gather at public executions, not just for the spectacle, but for the medicine. It was widely believed that the blood of a young man who died a violent, sudden death was a potent cure for epilepsy. As soon as the axe fell, people would rush forward with cups to catch the warm blood before it hit the dirt. They would drink it right there, still steaming, believing the life force of the condemned man would jump-start their own failing bodies. The sick were also treated with human skull powder. King Charles II of England was famous for his King's Drops, a personal tincture he made by distilling the scrapings of human skulls in alcohol. The best skulls, according to the scientists of the day, were those of Irish soldiers who had been left unburied on the battlefield, especially if they had grown moss on them. This moss, called usnea, was harvested and stuffed into the noses of the sick to stop bleeding. This era of medicine reveals a deep, dark hypocrisy. The same society that would burn a witch for heretical spells was perfectly comfortable eating the ground-up bones of their neighbors and drinking the blood of criminals.
They treated the human body not as a sacred vessel, but as a biological warehouse of spare parts. The sick were turned into inadvertent cannibals, fueled by a desperate, superstitious hunger to steal life from the dead to prolong their own.
As the 1800s roared into the Industrial Revolution, the world's great cities, London, New York, Paris, became death traps. This was the era of the Great Stink, a time when human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial chemicals flowed openly through the streets and into the very rivers people used for drinking water. But the most disturbing part of this era wasn't just the filth, it was the way the medical establishment looked at a dying man and blamed his moral character instead of the water he drank. When cholera arrived, it was like a ghost that could strike down a healthy family in hours. The symptoms were horrific, violent vomiting and rice water diarrhea so intense that a person could lose 10% of their body weight in a single afternoon. Their skin would turn a ghastly, bruised blue, earning it the name the Blue Death, and their faces would shrivel into a death mask while they were still conscious. Their blood became so thick from dehydration that it would stop flowing, and their muscles would cramp with such force that they would scream in agony until their heart gave out. The treatment of the sick during these outbreaks was defined by class warfare. Because the disease hit the slums the hardest, the wealthy and the doctors believed it was a scourge of the sinful. They argued that the sick were dying because they were lazy, drunk, or lacked godly hygiene. Instead of cleaning the water, the government's response was often to hold days of fasting and prayer. When the sick were taken to hospitals, they were subjected to heroic medicine. Since doctors believed the body was too full of fluid, despite the patient being deathly dehydrated, they would use tobacco smoke enemas. Yes, you read that correctly. They would take a bellows and blow tobacco smoke into the patient's rectum, believing the heat and stimulation would wake up the system. When that failed, they would wrap the blue, shivering patient in blankets soaked in boiling water or rub their skin with sandpaper to bring the blood to the surface. In London, the mystery was finally solved by Dr. John Snow, who realized the disease was coming from a single water pump on Broad Street. But for decades, the medical board laughed at him. They preferred the miasma theory because it allowed them to blame the smell of the poor. They let thousands more die in their own waste, treating the victims as social rot rather than suffering humans. The sick were left to die in the streets, their bodies often piled up outside of homes because the cholera carts couldn't keep up with the pace of the blue-skinned dead. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a specific and disturbing medical category emerged that targeted half the population: female hysteria. The term hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus, and for decades the medical establishment believed that a woman's entire physical and mental health was dictated by her reproductive organs. If a woman was too independent, too depressed, too energetic, or even if she just had a difficult personality, she was diagnosed with a disease that didn't actually exist. The way these sick women were treated remains one of the most chilling examples of medical gaslighting in history. The most famous treatment was the rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. This wasn't a relaxing vacation, it was a psychological prison. Women were confined to a bed for months at a time. They were forbidden to read, write, sew, or even talk to anyone. They were fed a diet of nothing but milk and bland puddings and were massaged by nurses so their muscles wouldn't completely atrophy. Imagine being a brilliant, creative mind like the author Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was subjected to this cure, and being told that the only way to be healthy was to embrace total intellectual death. Many women were driven into actual madness by the isolation and sensory deprivation. They were treated as if their brains were dangerous tools that needed to be locked away. For those who didn't respond to the rest cure, the treatments turned physical. Doctors often performed pelvic massages on hysterical patients to induce what they called paroxysmal contractions. This was done in a clinical, cold setting as a way to release the tension of the womb. When this became too tedious for doctors, it actually led to the invention of the first mechanical vibrators, medical devices sold to physicians to treat hysteria more efficiently.
But there was a darker side to this control. If a woman remained defiant, she could be committed to an asylum by her husband or father with almost no legal recourse. Once inside, they faced the hydrotherapy rooms. This involved being strapped into a tub with a heavy canvas cover, leaving only the head exposed, and being subjected to a continuous stream of water for hours or even days on end. Sometimes the water was boiling hot, other times it was ice cold. It was a form of waterboarding masquerading as medicine. In the most extreme cases, surgeons would perform oophorectomies, the removal of the ovaries, to cure mental instability. Thousands of women were surgically sterilized against their will or without fully understanding the procedure, all because they didn't fit the rigid social mold of a quiet woman. In this era, the sick weren't treated for their symptoms, they were punished for their existence.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, the greatest threat to a sick person wasn't always what happened while they were breathing, it was what happened the moment they stopped. As medical schools in the US and Britain grew, so did the demand for human bodies for dissection. But there was a problem. The law only allowed the use of executed criminals, and there weren't enough gallows to meet the demand. This created a lucrative shadow industry for a group of men known as the resurrectionists, or body snatchers. For the sick and the dying in the Victorian era, the fear of the sack-em-up men was a literal nightmare. If you were poor and dying in a hospital or an almshouse, you knew that your body was likely already sold before your heart stopped beating. Surgeons would often bribe hospital porters to tip them off the second a patient died. Within hours of being lowered into the earth, a team of men would arrive at the grave. They didn't dig up the whole coffin, they were too fast for that. They would dig a small hole at the head of the grave, break the coffin lid with a crowbar, and use a giant hook to drag the corpse out by its neck. The sick were treated as anatomical material rather than humans with souls. To protect their loved ones, the poor had to resort to desperate measures. They would set up grave watches where family members would sit by the grave with shotguns for weeks until the body had rotted enough to be useless to the doctors. The wealthy built mort safes, heavy iron cages or stone vaults, to lock their dead in a cage, terrified that even in death they would be stripped naked and sliced to pieces in a cold medical theater. But the most disturbing evolution of this trade happened when the resurrection men got impatient. They stopped waiting for people to die of natural causes. In Edinburgh, the infamous duo Burke and Hare realized that the sick were easy targets. They would find people who were ill, elderly, or intoxicated, and they would help them along. Their method was so specific it became known as burking. They would sit on the victim's chest and plug their nose and mouth, suffocating them so the body remained fresh and unmarked for the surgeons. The medical establishment turned a blind eye. The famous surgeon Robert Knox bought body after body from these murderers, never asking why the patients looked so healthy or why they were still warm. In this era, the sick weren't just victims of disease, they were a commodity. Their value was higher on a dissection table than it was in a hospital bed. The medical world didn't just want to cure the sick, it was hungry for their corpses, turning the final resting place into a marketplace of the macabre. The dawn of the 20th century promised a new era of scientific healing, but World War I turned the world into a massive industrial-scale laboratory for human suffering. For the first time, ancient bodies were meeting modern machines, tanks, machine guns, and high-explosive shells. The sick were now the shattered. But the way these soldiers were treated by a medical system struggling to catch up with the carnage was both revolutionary and deeply disturbing. Imagine a field hospital just miles behind the trenches. The wards were often mud-caked tents or abandoned churches where the floor was literally slippery with blood. Because of the sheer volume of casualties, doctors practiced a brutal form of triage. If a soldier arrived with a stomach wound, he was often set aside in a dying room and given nothing but a dose of morphine. They didn't even try to save him. It was considered a waste of time and thread. These men were left to listen to the screams of their comrades for days until they finally succumbed to sepsis or internal bleeding. But the most haunting sight in these hospitals were the men without faces.
Shrapnel from exploding shells would often rip away a soldier's jaw, nose, or cheek, leaving a gaping, raw hole where a human face used to be. At the time, there was no such thing as plastic surgery. These men were treated as monsters. They were often kept in isolated wards, forbidden from looking in mirrors, and their families were warned before visiting that the man they loved was gone, even though he was still breathing. The treatment was an experimental nightmare. Surgeons like Harold Gillies began the first attempts at facial reconstruction, but the methods were gruesome. To grow new skin for a missing nose, they would perform a pedicle flap. They would cut a strip of skin from the soldier's chest or arm, but leave one end attached to keep the blood flowing. They would then sew the loose end to the soldier's face. For weeks, the soldier would have to live with his arm literally sewn to his face, his body twisted in an agonizing, unmovable position until the skin took root in its new location. If the soldier moved or the wound became infected, which it often did, the entire process failed, leaving him even more scarred. For those whose faces could not be fixed, the medical community offered a chilling substitute, the 10 mask. Artists were hired to create thin, hand-painted metal masks that mimicked the soldier's pre-war appearance. These men would walk the streets with a frozen, painted smile or a glass eye fixed in a metal socket, unable to eat or speak without removing their face. They were the broken gargoyles of history, a generation of the sick who were physically kept alive by science, but socially buried behind masks because the world couldn't bear to look at the reality of what it had done to them. As we move into the late 1950s, the world believed the horrors of the past were over. We had antibiotics, we had sterile operating rooms, and we had wonder drugs. But this era of confidence led to one of the most heartbreaking medical disasters in history. It began with a pill marketed as completely safe. So safe, the advertisements claimed, that even pregnant women could take it for morning sickness without a worry. The drug was called thalidomide. The pharmaceutical companies were so convinced of its safety that they bypassed many of the rigorous testing protocols we have today. In West Germany, the UK, and parts of Canada, thousands of women began taking the drug to ease their nausea. They trusted their doctors, and their doctors trusted the colorful brochures. But behind the scenes, a biological catastrophe was unfolding. Thalidomide was doing something no one expected. It was crossing the placental barrier and attacking the developing limbs of fetuses. The treatment of the sick in this case wasn't just about the drug. It was about the silence and denial that followed. When babies began to be born with phocomelia, a condition where limbs are extremely shortened or entirely missing, with hands or feet attached directly to the torso, the medical community was baffled. For years, the pharmaceutical companies denied any connection to the drug. They blamed the mothers, suggesting they had taken other toxins or that it was a freak occurrence of nature. The way these children were treated was devastating. Because the world wasn't built for them, many were placed in institutions, hidden away from a society that viewed them as monstrous. Doctors, still operating with a fix-it mentality, fitted these infants with heavy, clunky, and often painful prosthetic limbs that were nearly impossible for a child to use. The children were forced into training sessions where they had to walk on wooden legs or use metal hooks, treated more like machines being calibrated than children who needed love and adaptation. In the United States, we narrowly escaped the worst of this tragedy thanks to one woman, Dr. Frances Kelsey. A reviewer for the FDA, she refused to approve thalidomide despite massive pressure from the manufacturer, citing a lack of safety data. Because of her stubbornness, the thalidomide babies in the U.S. were few, but the global impact was massive. Over 10,000 children were born with severe deformities, and thousands more died in the womb. This disaster changed the way we treat the sick forever, forcing the creation of the strict drug testing laws we have today. It was a hard-learned lesson that in the world of medicine, new doesn't always mean safe, and safe is a word that should never be used lightly. Before the 1950s, there was one name that struck more fear into the hearts of American parents than any other: polio. It was an invisible predator that targeted children, often leaving them paralyzed in a matter of days. But the most disturbing aspect of polio wasn't the paralysis of the legs, it was when the virus attacked the muscles used for breathing. This led to the creation of the most claustrophobic medical device ever conceived, the iron lung. Imagine being a 10-year-old child, suddenly unable to take a breath. You're rushed to a hospital and slid into a massive yellow metal cylinder. Only your head sticks out through a tight rubber collar. For the next several months, or in some cases the rest of your life, you're trapped inside this machine. The treatment involved the machine constantly changing air pressure to manually expand and contract your lungs. You couldn't move, you couldn't eat normally, and you couldn't even scratch an itch on your nose. The wards were filled with the rhythmic whoosh, clunk of dozens of machines breathing in unison. The sick were treated as if they were part of the machine itself. Nurses would use mirrors placed above the children's heads so they could see the room behind them, the only way they could watch the world. If the power went out, the machines would stop, and the children would begin to suffocate. Parents and nurses would have to frantically pump the bellows by hand for hours, praying for the electricity to return. While the iron lung saved lives, it was a psychological purgatory. Some survivors, like polio Paul Alexander, spent over 70 years inside one of these metal tubes. They were the pioneers of modern intensive care, but their lives were defined by a total loss of autonomy. They were the first generation of humans to be kept alive entirely by a machine, a haunting precursor to the ventilators of today, reminding us that sometimes survival comes at the cost of being entombed in the very thing that keeps you alive.
Long before we understood blood types, A, B, O, and the Rh factor, the medical world viewed blood as a mystical life juice that could be swapped between species as easily as pouring water between two cups. In the 17th century, doctors began to wonder, if a man is violent, could he be calmed by the blood of a gentle lamb? If a man is old and sluggish, could he be revitalized by the blood of a playful calf? The result was a period of medical history that borders on the occult. The first recorded transfusions didn't involve two humans. Instead, doctors would tie a feverish or insane patient to a table and place a bleeding sheep next to them. Using silver tubes and quills, they would connect the carotid artery of the animal directly to the vein of the human. Imagine the horror of lying there, feeling the hot alien blood of a different species pumping into your own heart. The biological reality was a nightmare. The human immune system would immediately go into a catastrophic shock. Patients would experience black urine, a sign that their kidneys were failing as they tried to filter out the foreign sheep cells. They would vomit, suffer from agonizing chest pains, and often fall into a coma. Yet, because a few survived the initial shock through sheer luck, the practice continued. When doctors did try human-to-human transfusions, they were no less disturbing. Without the knowledge of coagulation, the blood would often clot inside the tubes, turning into thick, jelly-like clumps that the doctors would try to poke through with needles. In some cases, the donor was a healthy servant or a poor laborer who was bled so dry to save a wealthy patient that the donor themselves would faint or die of heart failure. The most disturbing innovation came from a doctor named Jean-Baptiste Denis, who believed he could cure a man's madness by injecting him with calf's blood. When the man eventually died in a fit of convulsions after the third treatment, Denis was accused of murder. The practice was eventually banned by the Church and the Parliament of Paris, setting back the science of blood by nearly 150 years.
For over a century, the sick were denied the one thing that could actually save them, blood, all because the early cures were so horrific that they were deemed a crime against nature. In the 1800s, being a sick child was almost a death sentence, not just because of disease, but because of the very tools used to feed them. As the Industrial Revolution forced more mothers into factories, a new invention arrived to solve the problem of infant feeding, the long tube nursing bottle. On the surface, it looked like a miracle of convenience. It was a glass bottle with a long, flexible rubber tube that allowed the baby to feed themselves while lying in a crib. Advertisers called them the mother's helper. But inside those tubes, a microscopic massacre was taking place. The Victorian era had no concept of sterilization. The long, narrow tubes were made of porous rubber and were almost impossible to clean. Inside the dark, damp neck of the tube, milk would curdle and rot, creating a breeding ground for deadly bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. Even if a mother washed the bottle, the black slime inside the tube remained. Medical journals of the time began to notice a terrifying trend. Thousands of infants were dying of summer diarrhea or failure to thrive. The babies would become severely dehydrated, their eyes sinking into their skulls, their skin becoming paper thin. When doctors inspected the sick infants, they didn't look at the bottles. They blamed the bad air or the mother's weak constitution. In reality, these babies were being fed a literal poison with every meal. These bottles became so notorious among those who understood the filth that they earned a gruesome nickname in the medical underground: the murder bottles. It wasn't until the very end of the century, through the tireless work of health reformers, that these bottles were finally exposed as death traps. An entire generation of the most vulnerable sick was wiped out simply because we prioritized convenience over the basic laws of hygiene.
As the 19th century progressed, a new kind of sickness emerged, not from a virus or a parasite, but from the very air of the industrial workplace. While we've discussed mercury as a medicine, its most disturbing impact was on the workers who handled it daily, specifically in the hat-making industry. This gave rise to the phrase, "mad as a hatter," but the reality behind the idiom wasn't a whimsical fairy tale. It was a slow, agonizing disintegration of the human nervous system. To turn coarse fur into the smooth felt used for top hats, workers used a process called carroting, which involved washing the fur in a solution of mercury nitrate. In poorly ventilated rooms, the air became thick with invisible, odorless mercury vapors. The workers, many of them young men and women, spent 12 hours a day breathing in this heavy metal. It didn't kill them instantly. Instead, it stole their humanity, piece by piece. The first sign was the hatter's shakes. A worker's hands would begin to tremble so violently they couldn't hold a spoon to their mouths. But the most disturbing part was the psychological shift, known as erethism. These people became pathologically shy, irritable, and prone to fits of melancholy. If a stranger looked at them, they might burst into tears or fly into a violent rage. Their teeth would turn black and fall out. Their gums would ulcerate and bleed constantly. The medical establishment of the time treated these sick workers with utter disdain. Because the symptoms looked like drunkenness or moral weakness, many hatters were thrown into asylums or workhouses. They were mocked for their stutters and their tremors. Their tremors were so legendary that in some towns you could tell a person's profession just by the way they walked down the street, shaking and twitching like a marionette on broken strings. Even when the link between mercury and the shakes became undeniable, factory owners fought against any changes, claiming that mercury was essential to the economy. The sick were treated as disposable fuel for the fires of industry. They were left to die in poverty, their brains literally melted by the toxic metal, their bodies twitching even in their final moments of life. It was a world where a fashionable hat was worth more than the life of the person who made it. Chapter 22. The Body in the Barrel. The Macabre Origins of Anatomy.
While we've touched on body snatchers, we haven't discussed the truly disturbing way medical students and professors interacted with the sick after they had passed. In the 1700s, if you were a prisoner, a pauper, or a friendless person who died in a charity ward, your body didn't belong to your family, it belonged to the state, specifically to the dissecting knife. To become a doctor, you had to understand the architecture of the soul, but the way this was taught was far from clinical. It was a scene out of a horror movie. Dissections were often held in anatomy theaters that were open to the public for a fee. The sick were turned into a macabre educational show. Because there was no refrigeration, the smell in these rooms was so overpowering that students would soak sponges in vinegar and tie them to their noses just to keep from fainting. The subject on the table would slowly rot over the course of the week-long lecture. By day 3, the internal organs would be a green liquefied mess. By day 5, the limbs were often black with decay. Yet the professor would continue to dig through the remains, showing the students the beauty of human biology. The most disturbing part was the preservation methods. To keep parts of the sick for future study, doctors would create pickled specimens. They would take the heart of a child who died of a rare defect, or the hand of a man with a strange growth, and drop it into a jar of high-proof brandy or formaldehyde. In some prestigious medical schools, it was rumored that the brandy used to preserve the specimens was occasionally stolen and drunk by desperate, impoverished students. In some cases, the skin of the sick was even more valuable than their organs. There is a dark history of anthropodermic bibliopegy, the practice of binding books in human skin. If a particularly famous criminal or a person with a fascinating disease died, their skin would sometimes be tanned like leather and used to bind the very medical reports that described their death. You could walk into a university library and pull down a book only to realize you were touching the actual flesh of the patient described on the pages. The sick were not just studied, they were processed, preserved, and turned into library decor.